Never trust family to have your back when money's involved. Marlene discovered this the hard way at 62 years old when her own son kicked her out of the house she'd been paying the mortgage on for 20 years. All because she refused to hand over $50,000 for a cruise. Yeah, you heard that right. $50,000 for a vacation. Picture this. You spent your entire adult life sacrificing everything for your child. You worked double shifts at the local diner, scraping together every penny to put your son through college. You delayed your own dreams, postponed your retirement, and lived in the same small house for decades just to make sure your kid had everything he needed. Then one day, that same child looks you in the eye and tells you to get out because you won't fund his wife's luxury vacation. That's exactly what happened to Marlene, and her story is going to make you question everything you think you know about family loyalty. Marlene had always been the type of woman who put everyone else first. She was one of those people who would give you the shirt off her back without thinking twice about it. When her husband died 15 years ago, leaving her alone to raise her teenage son David, she didn't fall apart. She didn't seek sympathy or ask for help. She just rolled up her sleeves and got to work. The life insurance barely covered the funeral costs, and there was still a mortgage to pay, groceries to buy, and a teenage boy who needed new shoes every few months because his feet kept growing. So Marlene did what she had to do. She took on extra shifts at Miller's Diner, where she'd been working part-time since David was little. The owner, Mrs. Miller, was understanding about her situation and let her work breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner shifts when they were short-staffed. Marlene's hands were always stained with coffee, and her feet always ached from standing on them for 12 hours straight. But she never complained. Not once. She had a goal, and that goal was making sure David had every opportunity she never had. David was a smart kid, always had been. He got good grades without much effort, and had this charm about him that made teachers love him and classmates want to be his friend. Marlene was so proud of him. She'd sit at parent-teacher conferences listening to his teachers praise his potential, and she'd think about how different his life was going to be from hers. He wasn't going to work in a diner. He wasn't going to struggle to pay bills. He was in a college, and after that, he was going to have the kind of life that came with a steady paycheck and respect from others. When David graduated high school, Marlene had saved up enough money to cover his first year at State University. It wasn't easy. She'd been putting away $20 or $30 here and there, sometimes more when she got good tips from the regular customers who knew her story. She'd skip buying new clothes for herself, would eat the leftover food from the diner instead of buying groceries, and had mastered the art of making $5 stretch for a week when times were really tight. But she did it. She had the money for his tuition, room, and board, and even a little extra for books and supplies. College was expensive, though, more expensive than Marlene had realized when she started saving. What she thought would be enough for 4 years barely covered 2. So she took on more work. She started cleaning houses on weekends, doing odd jobs for neighbors, and even picked up a few shifts at the grocery store on her days off from the diner. Her body was tired, constantly tired, but every time she felt like giving up, she'd think about David's future. She'd picture him in a cap and gown, holding that diploma, starting a career that would give him security and respect. That image kept her going through the exhaustion and the aching joints and the nights when she fell asleep still wearing her work uniform because she was too tired to change. David did graduate, finally, with a degree in business management. Marlene cried at his graduation ceremony, not just from pride but from relief. She'd done it. She'd gotten her son through college. All those years of sacrifice had been worth it. Now David could start his adult life with opportunities she'd never had. He could build something for himself, maybe even start families someday, and give her grandchildren to spoil. And David did start building a life. He got a job at a marketing firm in the city. Nothing fancy, but steady work with room for advancement. Within a year, he met Lilia at some work event. Lilia was the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. She had perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive clothes, and this way of speaking that made everything sound important. Even when she was just talking about the weather, she came from money. The kind of family where vacations to Europe were normal and designer handbags were everyday accessories rather than special occasion purchases. Marlene tried to like Lilia. She really did. When David brought her home for the first time, Marlene had cleaned the house from top to bottom and cooked a special dinner. She wanted to make a good impression, wanted to show that even though they didn't have much, they had love and warmth to offer. But Lilia had walked through their small house with this look on her face, like she was trying not to touch anything. She'd picked at her food and made polite conversation, but Marlene could tell she was counting the minutes until she could leave. David didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't want to notice. He was head over heels in love with Lilia, and Marlene understood why. Lilia was beautiful and sophisticated, everything that David's life in their small town wasn't. When they got engaged after dating for 8 months, Marlene was happy for them, even though something in her gut told her this wasn't going to be easy. The wedding was expensive, way more expensive than anything Marlene had ever imagined. Lilia's family paid for most of it, which was good because Marlene couldn't have afforded even a fraction of what they spent. The venue alone cost more than Marlene made in 6 months, but she contributed what she could, paying for David's tuxedo and the rehearsal dinner, dipping into her retirement savings to make sure her son had everything he wanted for his special day. After the wedding, David and Lilia moved into Marlene's house temporarily while they saved up for a place of their own. At least, that's what they said it was going to be. Temporary. Just for a few months until they found the right apartment in the city. Marlene didn't mind. The house felt empty with just her in it, and having David home again reminded her of when he was younger, before life got so complicated. But months turned into a year, and David and Lilia showed no signs of moving out. Lilia had opinions about everything in the house. The furniture was too old-fashioned. The kitchen needed updating. The living room was too small for entertaining. She'd make these comments casually, like she was just thinking out loud, but Marlene heard the criticism in every word. Still, she kept her mouth shut. This was temporary. She told herself. They'd move out soon, and then she could have her house back the way she liked it. The problem was Lilia had expensive tastes, and David's salary wasn't enough to support the lifestyle she wanted. They talked about moving out, but every apartment Lilia liked was way beyond their budget. She'd find places in trendy neighborhoods with granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, places that cost 3 times what David made in a month. When David would gently suggest they look at something more affordable, Lilia would get upset. She'd talk about how hard it was to adjust to a different lifestyle, how she'd given up so much to be with him. And David wanted to make his wife happy, would promise they'd find a way to afford whatever she wanted. That's when the requests started. Small things at first. Could Marlene help with the electric bill this month because David's car needed repairs? Could she pick up groceries because they were trying to save money for a security deposit? Could she cover their cell phone bill just this once because they'd had some unexpected expenses? Each request came with explanations and promises to pay her back, and each time, Marlene said yes. She understood what it was like to struggle with money, and she wanted to help her son and daughter-in-law get on their feet. But the requests got bigger and more frequent. Soon, Marlene was paying most of the household expenses while David and Lilia saved their money for their future apartment. Except they never seemed to save enough, and they never seemed to move any closer to actually moving out. Marlene's retirement savings, which she'd been slowly rebuilding after paying for David's college, started shrinking again. She was back to working extra shifts and skipping things she needed for herself, just like when David was in school. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in March. Marlene was getting ready for her early shift at the diner when Lilia knocked on her bedroom door. This was unusual because Lilia usually avoided talking to Marlene directly, preferring to communicate through David or just make passive comments that Marlene was supposed to interpret. But that morning, Lilia came right into Marlene's room, without waiting for permission, holding what looked like travel brochures and wearing the kind of excited expression that meant she wanted something big. "Marlene, I have the most amazing news," Lilia said, spreading the brochures across Marlene's unmade bed. "My college roommate Jessica just got engaged, and she's planning this incredible celebration cruise for all her closest friends. It's a 3-week luxury cruise through the Mediterranean, stopping at all the most beautiful ports. Spain, Italy, Greece, Turkey. Can you imagine? It's going to be absolutely magical." Marlene looked at the brochures while buttoning up her diner uniform. The picture showed enormous cruise ships with swimming pools and fancy restaurants. Couples sipping champagne on balconies overlooking crystal blue water. It looked nice, the kind of vacation Marlene had sometimes dreamed about taking someday, when she retired. But she couldn't figure out why Lilia was showing her this. "That sounds lovely for your friend," Marlene said carefully. "I'm sure she'll have a wonderful time." Lilia laughed like Marlene had made a joke. "Oh no, you don't understand. Jessica invited me to come along. Me and David. It's going to be like a 3-week party with all my closest friends from college. We'll get to see parts of Europe I've never visited before. Eat at restaurants I've only read about in magazines. The ship has a spa and a casino and even a rock climbing wall. David's never been on a real vacation. Not like this. Can you imagine how incredible it would be for him?" Now Marlene understood why Lilia was in her room at 7 in the morning. This wasn't just about sharing exciting news. This was about money. Everything with Lilia eventually came back to money. Marlene sat down on the edge of her bed, suddenly feeling much older than her 62 years. "How much does something like this cost?" Marlene asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. Lilia's eyes lit up like she'd been waiting for exactly this question. "Well, that's the beautiful part. Because Jessica's family is booking so many rooms, we're getting a group discount. It's only $50,000 for both of us. That includes everything. The room, all our meals, entertainment, shore excursions. When you think about it, it's actually a really good deal for 3 weeks in Europe." $50,000. Marlene felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. That was more money than she'd saved for her entire retirement. That was more than her car was worth. That was almost what she made in 2 full years at the diner, before taxes. She stared at Lilia, trying to process what she was hearing. $50,000, Marlene repeated slowly. "For vacation." "For the vacation of a lifetime," Lilia corrected. "Marlene, you have to understand how important this is. All my friends from college will be there. These are people I haven't seen in years. People who are doing amazing things with their lives. I can't show up looking like I can't afford to be there. And David deserves this. He's worked so hard, and he's never had the chance to see the world. This could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for both of us." Marlene stood up and walked to her dresser, pretending to look for something while she tried to calm down. $50,000. Where did Lilia think that kind of money was just going to come from? Did she think Marlene had some secret bank account full of money she'd been hiding? Did she think working at a diner for 30 years made someone wealthy? "Lilia, I don't have $50,000, Marlene said quietly. "I don't have anything close to $50,000. "But you have savings," Lilia pressed. "You've been working for so long, and you don't spend money on anything for yourself. Plus, you could take out a loan against the house. Houses like this one, even older ones, they have equity built up. You could probably get a home equity loan for way more than $50,000 if you needed to." The suggestion that Marlene should mortgage her house to pay for Lilia's vacation made her feel sick. This house was the only security she had. It was the one thing she owned outright, the one thing that meant she'd never be homeless in her old age. The idea of putting it at risk for a cruise ship vacation was so absurd that Marlene couldn't even form words to respond at first. "I'm not taking out a loan against my house for a vacation," Marlene finally said. "And I don't have $50,000 in savings. Even if I did, that's money I've saved for my retirement. I'm 62 years old, Lilia. I need that money to live on when I can't work anymore." Lilia's expression changed from excited to disappointed to something harder. "But this isn't just any vacation. This is important for David's future. These are the kind of people who could help his career. Networking is everything in business. And this cruise is going to be full of successful people. The connections he could make might be worth way more than $50,000 in the long run. Then David can save up and pay for it himself," Marlene said, surprised by how firm her own voice sounded. "Or you can ask your parents to help. But I'm not spending my retirement money on a cruise." That's when Lilia's mask really came off. The sweet, grateful daughter-in-law act disappeared, and Marlene saw what had been underneath it all along. Lilia's face hardened, and her voice got cold in a way that made the small bedroom feel even smaller. "I see how it is," Lilia said slowly. "You don't care about David's happiness or his future. You just want to hoard your money like some old miser. Do you know how embarrassing this is going to be for me? Having to tell Jessica that we can't come because David's mother won't help us? These people already think I'm married beneath me, and now you're proving them right." The words hit Marlene like physical blows. After everything she'd sacrificed for David, after all the years of putting his needs before her own, now she was being called selfish for wanting to keep her retirement savings, for not wanting to risk her home for someone else's vacation. The injustice of it made her hands shake with anger. "I have given everything for David," Marlene said, her voice rising. "I worked myself to the bone to put him through college. I've been supporting both of you for over a year while you live in my house and eat my food. I have never been selfish when it comes to my son, but I will not give you $50,000 for a vacation. Find another way to pay for it, or don't go." Lilia stood up abruptly, the travel brochures scattering to the floor. "We'll see about that," she said, and stormed out of the room, leaving Marlene standing there shaking with adrenaline and disbelief. The rest of that day at the diner, Marlene couldn't concentrate on anything. She mixed up orders, spilled coffee, and gave the wrong change to customers. Mrs. Miller finally asked if she was feeling all right and suggested she go home early. But Marlene didn't want to go home. She didn't want to face whatever was waiting for her there after her confrontation with Lilia. When she finally did get home that evening, she knew immediately that something had changed. David was waiting for her in the living room, sitting stiffly on the couch with his hands folded in his lap. Lilia was nowhere to be seen, but Marlene could hear her moving around upstairs, opening and closing drawers with more force than necessary. "Mom, we need to talk," David said, and the formal tone in his voice made Marlene's stomach drop. This wasn't her son talking to his mother. This was someone delivering bad news to someone they didn't particularly care about. "Lilia told me about your conversation this morning." David continued before Marlene could respond. "I have to say, I'm really disappointed in you. I thought you'd be happy for us, excited that we have this opportunity. But instead, you're being selfish and stubborn." Selfish. There was that word again. Marlene sat down heavily in her favorite chair, the one by the window where she used to read to David when he was little. Now he was using it as evidence of her selfishness. "David, $50,000 is an enormous amount of money," she said carefully. "It's more than I have. Even if I did have it, that's money I need for when I'm too old to work. You're young. You and Lilia have your whole careers ahead of you. If this vacation is so important, you can save up for it." "Save up for it?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, this cruise is happening in 6 weeks. Jessica needed to know by tomorrow if we're coming so she can finalize the bookings. We can't just save up $50,000 in 6 weeks. "Then maybe this isn't the right time for this kind of vacation," Marlene suggested. "Maybe you should wait until you can afford it on your own." David's face flushed red, and suddenly he looked exactly like he had as a little boy when he didn't get his way. Except now he was a grown man, and his tantrums had real consequences. "You know what, Mom? I'm tired of this. I'm tired of you acting like you're poor when I know you have money saved up. I'm tired of you making us feel guilty for living here when we're helping you by paying some of the expenses. And I'm really tired of you putting your own comfort ahead of your son's happiness." The accusation was so unfair, so completely opposite to reality, that Marlene felt dizzy. "David, I have never put my comfort ahead of your happiness. Everything I've done for the past 25 years has been for you. Everything you've done has been to control me." David shot back. "To make me feel guilty and obligated to you. Well, I'm done feeling guilty. Lilia and I have been talking, and we think it's time for some changes around here." That's when Lilia came downstairs, carrying 2 large suitcases. She'd been packing while David delivered whatever ultimatum they'd planned together. She set the suitcases down by the front door and turned to face Marlene with a cold smile. "We decided to move out," Lilia announced. "We found a place in the city that we can afford if we're not wasting money helping to support this house. We'll be gone by the weekend." Marlene felt a moment of relief. Finally, she'd have her house back. She could stop supporting 2 additional adults and focus on rebuilding her retirement savings. But then David spoke again, and she realized this wasn't about the moving out. This was about punishment. The thing is, Mom, we've been paying a lot of expenses here. The utilities, groceries, maintenance costs. Without our contribution, I don't think you'll be able to afford to keep this place. So we think you should sell the house and find somewhere smaller and cheaper to live. The words hung in the air like poison gas, making it hard for Marlene to breathe. Sell the house. Her house. The house she'd been making payments on for over 20 years. The house where she'd raised David, where she'd planned to spend her golden years, where every room held memories of birthdays and holidays and quiet evenings reading together. They wanted her to sell her house because they were taking their money with them when they left. This is my house, Marlene said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. I've been paying the mortgage on this house since before you were married, David, long before you moved in here. Lilia laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the room. Your house? David's been contributing to the mortgage payments for over a year. He's been paying the utilities and buying groceries and handling repairs. Without him, you'll never be able to afford all of that on a diner waitress salary. I was paying for everything just fine before you moved in, Marlene pointed out. I can do it again. Could you, though? David asked, and there was something cruel in his voice that Marlene had never heard before. Because from what I can see, you've been struggling financially for years. Your car is falling apart. Your clothes are old and worn out. You never go anywhere or do anything because you can't afford it. Maybe it's time to accept that you can't maintain this lifestyle on your own anymore. The attack on her circumstances felt deliberately designed to humiliate her. Yes, her car was old. Yes, her clothes were practical rather than fashionable. But those were choices she'd made to save money, not signs that she couldn't take care of herself. She'd been taking care of herself and David long before Lilia came into the picture. I can take care of myself just fine, Marlene said firmly. And I'm not selling my house. That's when Lilia stepped forward, her face twisted with an anger that seemed way out of proportion to the situation. You selfish old woman, she hissed. Do you have any idea what you're doing to David? Do you understand how embarrassing this is for him? His friends' mothers would do anything to help their children succeed. They'd be proud to contribute to something that could advance their son's career. But not you. You'd rather cling to your money and your little house than see David reach his potential. Something inside Marlene snapped. After more than a year of listening to Lilia's passive-aggressive comments about the house, the furniture, the neighborhood, after months of paying for 2 additional adults while they saved money for their own future, after working extra shifts to cover expenses that used to be manageable, she'd had enough. Get out, Marlene said, standing up from her chair. Both of you. Get out of my house right now. This isn't just your house anymore, Lilia shot back. David has been paying to live here. He has rights. He has the right to leave, Marlene replied, which is what you both said you're doing anyway. So do it. Pack your things and go. That's when it happened. That's when Lilia completely lost control and did something that changed everything forever. She raised her hand and slapped Marlene across the face, hard enough that Marlene stumbled backward and had to grab the arm of her chair to keep from falling. The slap itself wasn't what hurt most, though Marlene's cheek burned and her eye watered from the impact. What hurt most was David's reaction, or rather, his lack of reaction. He didn't rush to his mother's defense. He didn't tell his wife that hitting an elderly woman was unacceptable. He just stood there, watching like he thought Marlene deserved it. Don't you ever speak to me like that again, Lilia screamed, her face red with rage. I am not some trashy girl you can disrespect. I come from a good family, and I deserve to be treated with respect in this house. Marlene touched her cheek, feeling the heat where Lilia's hand had connected. In all her years, through all the hardships and struggles and disappointments, no one had ever raised a hand to her. Not even during her worst days as a struggling single mother had anyone treated her with such contempt. You need to leave, Marlene said quietly. Both of you need to leave right now, before I call the police. David finally spoke up, but not to defend his mother or condemn his wife's violence. Mom, you're being dramatic. Lilia is just upset because you're being so unreasonable about this whole thing. If you just agree to help us with the cruise money, none of this would be happening. The victim blaming was almost worse than the slap itself. David was actually suggesting that Marlene was responsible for his wife hitting her, that if she'd just given him $50,000 like a good little ATM machine, she wouldn't have been assaulted in her own living room. "I want both of you out of this house tonight," Marlene said, her voice shaking but determined. "I don't care where you go, but you're not spending another night under my roof." Lilia laughed again, that same cruel sound. "Fine, we'll leave, but don't think you've won anything here. Without David's income helping with the expenses, you'll lose this house within 6 months. And when you do, don't come cry to us for help." "I wouldn't ask you for help if I was starving in the street," Marlene replied, and she meant every word. The next few hours were a blur of slamming doors and angry voices as David and Lilia packed their belongings. They took more than just their own stuff, Marlene noticed. They took the good towels that Marlene had received as wedding gifts 25 years ago. They took the television from the living room, claiming David had bought it, though Marlene remembered contributing half the money for it. They took kitchen appliances and even some of the groceries, leaving Marlene with an emptier house and bare cupboards. When they finally left, slamming the front door hard enough to rattle the windows, the silence that followed was deafening. Marlene sat in her living room, touching her still sore cheek, trying to process what had just happened. Her son was gone. Her daughter-in-law had hit her, and she was alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty and impossible to maintain. The first few days after David and Lilia left were the hardest. Marlene went to work at the diner and pretended everything was normal, but inside, she felt like she was falling apart. Mrs. Miller noticed a bruise on her cheek and asked what happened, but Marlene just said she bumped into a door. She couldn't bear to tell anyone the truth. The shame of being hit by her daughter-in-law, of being abandoned by her son, felt too heavy to share. The financial reality hit her within the first month. Without David and Lilia's contributions, Marlene was indeed struggling to cover all the household expenses. The mortgage payment alone took most of her paycheck from the diner, leaving very little for utilities, groceries, and maintenance. She picked up every extra shift she could get, but at 62, working 70 hours a week was taking a physical toll that she couldn't ignore. By the second month, Marlene had fallen behind on the electric bill. By the third month, she was borrowing money from her retirement savings just to buy groceries. The house that had been her security was becoming a financial burden she couldn't shoulder alone. She started to wonder if David and Lilia had been right about her needing to sell it. The thought of giving up her house felt like giving up everything she'd worked for. This house represented decades of sacrifice and determination. It was proof that she'd been able to provide for herself and her son despite all the obstacles life had thrown at them. Selling it would feel like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that she really couldn't take care of herself anymore. But the bills kept coming, and Marlene's savings kept shrinking. She started missing mortgage payments. First one, then two, then three. The bank sent letters that became increasingly urgent and threatening. Foreclosure proceedings were mentioned. Legal action was threatened. Marlene felt like she was drowning in paperwork and debt, and the crushing weight of trying to maintain something that was slipping away despite her best efforts. 6 months after David and Lilia left, Marlene received the final notice. She had 30 days to bring her mortgage current or lose the house to foreclosure. The amount she owed, including late fees and penalties, was more than she could possibly raise. Her retirement savings were almost gone, depleted by months of trying to cover expenses that had been manageable when she had help but were impossible alone. On a cold October morning, Marlene found herself packing her belongings into garbage bags and loading them into her 15-year-old Honda Civic. The foreclosure process had moved faster than she'd expected, and she had to be out of the house by noon. She found a small storage unit for most of her furniture, but there wasn't room for everything. She had to leave behind the dining room table where she'd helped David with his homework, the rocking chair where she'd nursed him through childhood illnesses, the bed where she dreamed of growing old peacefully in her own home. The worst part was that David knew what was happening. Marlene had swallowed her pride and called him 2 weeks earlier, hoping that maybe they could work something out. Maybe he could help with a few mortgage payments until she got back on her feet. Maybe they could have a conversation about what had happened and find a way to repair their relationship. But when David answered the phone, his voice was cold and distant. When Marlene explained that she was about to lose the house, he didn't offer to help. Instead, he said, "I warned you this would happen, Mom. You should have been more reasonable about helping us when you had the chance." Then he'd hung up, leaving Marlene listening to a dial tone and wondering how the little boy she'd raised had turned into someone so heartless. That first night sleeping in her car was the longest night of Marlene's life. She'd parked in the lot of a 24-hour grocery store, hoping no one would notice or bother her. The Honda seats didn't recline very far, and every time she shifted position, her back ached from the awkward angle. She brought a pillow and a thin blanket from the house, but nothing could make the car comfortable or warm enough for sleeping. Around 3 a.m, a security guard knocked on her window, making her jump awake with her heart pounding. The young man looked embarrassed when he saw she was an older woman, not some teenager causing trouble. He explained gently that she couldn't stay parked there overnight, that it was store policy. Marlene apologized and started the engine, driving around aimlessly until she found another parking lot where she could try to get a few more hours of sleep before her shift at the diner started. The next few days blurred together in a nightmare of exhaustion and desperation. Marlene would work her shift at the diner, then spend the afternoon looking for affordable rental apartments that would accept someone with her damaged credit and limited income. Every place she looked at was either too expensive, too run down, or had a waiting list months long. Some landlords took one look at her application, saw that she'd recently been foreclosed on, and told her immediately that she didn't qualify. In the evenings, she'd drive to different parking lots, try to find safe places to spend the night. She learned to avoid well-lit areas where security guard would ask her to move along, but she also avoided dark, isolated spots where she didn't feel safe as a woman alone. She became an expert at finding the middle ground, places that were quiet enough that she wouldn't be bothered, but public enough that she felt relatively secure. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort, though her back ached constantly from sleeping in the car and her neck was stiff from the awkward sleeping position. The worst part was the shame. Marlene had always been proud of her independence, her ability to take care of herself and provide for her family. Now she was homeless at 62, washing her face in gas station bathrooms and changing clothes in the cramped front seat of her car. She kept working at the diner, partly because she needed the money, but mostly because it was the only normal thing left in her life. For 8 hours a day, she could pretend everything was fine. She could serve coffee and take orders and chat with regular customers who had no idea that she was living out of her car. Mrs. Miller noticed that Marlene looked tired and stressed, but she attributed it to the recent move and didn't pry too deeply. After 2 weeks of sleeping in her car, Marlene discovered the marina. It was about 10 minutes from the diner, a large recreational boat harbor with a big parking lot that never seemed to close. There were always a few cars parked there overnight, people who'd been out late on their boats or visitors who'd had too much to drink and didn't want to drive home. Her Honda blended in with the other vehicles. And the security, there seemed more focus on the boats than on the parking lot. The marina became Marlene's new home base. She'd park there every night, positioning her car where she could see the water and the boats bobbing peacefully in their slips. There was something calming about the sound of water lapping against the docks and the gentle rocking motion of the boats. It reminded her of happier times, of the few vacations she and her late husband had taken to the coast when David was young. During the day, when she wasn't working, Marlene would walk around the marina. There were public restrooms that were cleaner than most gas stations, and she could sit on benches overlooking the water while she ate her meals or made phone calls about potential housing. The marina had become her refuge, the closest thing to peace she could find in her chaotic new reality. It was during one of these walks, about 3 weeks into her homelessness, that Marlene's life changed completely. She was sitting on a bench eating a sandwich from the diner when a voice behind her said, "Marlene? Marlene Richardson? Is that really you?" She turned around to see a man about her age walking toward her with a confused but pleased expression. He was tall and well-dressed, with silver hair and kind eyes that looked familiar. It took her a moment to place him, but when she did, her heart nearly stopped. "James Morrison, she said softly, hardly believing her own voice. Oh my goodness, James. James Morrison had been her first love, her high school sweetheart. The boy she planned to marry before life took them in different directions. He'd wanted to join the Navy after graduation, see the world, have adventures before settling down. Marlene had wanted to get married right away, start a family, build a stable life in their hometown. They'd broken up the summer after graduation, both of them crying, but knowing they wanted different things. That had been over 40 years ago. Marlene had married Robert 2 years later, had David, built a life that had seemed complete and satisfying. She'd wonder about James over the years, especially during the lonely years after Robert died. But she'd never tried to contact him. Their lives had gone in different directions, and she'd assumed they'd stay that way. Now here he was, looking successful and confident in his expensive casual clothes, obviously shocked to see her sitting alone by the marina in the middle of a weekday afternoon. Marlene suddenly became aware of how she must look, tired, worn down, her clothes practical but clearly not new. She felt like a shabby ghost of the young woman James had once loved. "I can't believe it's really you," James said, sitting down on the bench beside her. "What are you doing here? Do you live around here now?" The question was innocent, but it hit Marlene like a punch to the stomach. How could she explain that she was living in her car? How could she tell her first love, who obviously had done well for himself, that she was homeless and desperate? The shame rose in her throat like bile, making it hard to speak. I'm between places right now," she managed to say, which was technically true if completely misleading. James nodded like that made perfect sense. "I heard about Robert's passing," he said gently. "I'm so sorry for your loss. He was a good man." "Thank you," Marlene said, surprised that James had kept track of her life enough to know about Robert's death. "It's been hard, but David and I got through it. David's your son, right? How's he doing?" The question opened up a wound that was still raw and bleeding. How could she explain that David had abandoned her, that he'd chosen his wife over his mother, and hadn't spoken to her since she'd lost a house? That her own child had watched her become homeless and done nothing to help? "David's fine," she lied, forcing a smile. "He's married now, living in the city, doing well for himself." James smiled warmly. "That's wonderful. You must be so proud of him." The irony of the statement made Marlene's chest tight. She had been proud of David, so proud that she'd sacrificed everything for his future. Now she wasn't sure what she felt about him anymore. Disappointment, hurt, a deep sadness that the loving relationship they'd once had was apparently gone forever. "What about you?" Marlene asked, desperate to change the subject away from her own circumstances. "What brings you to the marina? Do you have a boat here?" James laughed, a rich sound that reminded Marlene of the boy she'd once known. "I own the marina, actually. Well, this marina and 3 others along the coast. Morrison Maritime. Maybe you've seen the signs?" Marlene had indeed seen the signs, but she'd never connected them with the James Morrison she'd known in high school. Morrison was a common enough name, and she'd never imagined that her old boyfriend had become successful enough to own multiple marinas. "You own all this?" she asked, looking around at the impressive facility with new eyes. "Started with one small marina about 15 years ago," James explained. "Got lucky with some investments, made some good business decisions. Now we got the marinas, a small fleet of charter boats, and we're just getting into the cruise ship business. Nothing huge, just smaller luxury cruises for people who want a more intimate experience than the big commercial cruise lines." The mention of cruise ships made Marlene's stomach turn. The whole disaster with David and Lilia had started with a cruise ship, with $50,000 she didn't have and a vacation she couldn't afford. But she pushed those thoughts away and tried to focus on James's success story. "That's incredible," she said, and she meant it. "You always talked about wanting to see the world when we were kids. Sounds like you found a way to make that dream work for you." James looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I did see the world, eventually. Spent 12 years in the Navy, visited ports all over the globe. But you know what I learned during all that traveling." "What?" Marlene asked. "That the place you want to come home to is more important than all the places you visit," he said quietly. And I never found that place, Marlene. I never found someone I wanted to come home to. The words hung between them, loaded with 40 years of what if and might have been. Marlene felt her cheeks flush, and she looked away from James's intense gaze toward the water, where a few sailboats were heading out for an afternoon cruise. "I'm sure you had plenty of opportunities," she said carefully. "A successful man like you." "I was married for a while," James admitted. 10 years, actually, but it never felt right. She was a good woman, but we wanted different things. She wanted to settle down in the suburbs and have kids and live a quiet life. I want to keep building the business, keep traveling, keep taking risks. Sound familiar? It did sound familiar, painfully familiar. The same fundamental differences that had broken them up 40 years ago had apparently destroyed James's marriage too. Marlene wondered if they both spent their lives making the wrong choices, choosing security over love, or love over security, and ending up with neither. "I'm sorry your marriage didn't work out," Marlene said softly. "Don't be," James replied with a slight smile. "We're both happier now. She remarried a nice accountant who wants the same quiet life she does. And I got to keep building something I'm passionate about." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the boats and listening to the sounds of Marina. Marlene felt more relaxed than she had in months, despite the awkwardness of her situation. There was something about James's presence that reminded her of who she used to be, before years of struggle and sacrifice had worn her down. "Marlene," James said eventually, "can I ask you something? And I want you to be honest with me." Her stomach clenched with anxiety. "Of course. Are you okay? Really okay? Because I have to tell you, you look like someone who's been through hell recently." The question was asked with such genuine concern that Marlene felt tears threatening for the first time in weeks. She'd been so focused on just surviving day to day that she hadn't allowed herself to really feel the full weight of what had happened to her. But James's kindness opened something inside her that she'd been keeping carefully closed. "I'm not okay," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm really not okay." James moved closer to her on the bench. "What happened?" And somehow, sitting there by the water with the one person who had known her before life got complicated, Marlene found herself telling him everything. She told him about David's marriage to Lilia, about supporting them for over a year, about the $50,000 cruise demand. She told him about the slap, about David choosing his wife over his mother, about losing the house to foreclosure. The hardest part was admitting that she'd been living in her car for 3 weeks. She watched James's face as she spoke, expecting to see pity or disgust or the kind of judgment she'd been dreading from everyone. Instead, she saw anger. Not anger at her, but anger on her behalf. "Your son let you become homeless?" James asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. "His wife hit you, and he let you become homeless?" "It's complicated," Marlene said, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't really that complicated. David had chosen to side with his wife against his mother, and when the consequences of that choice became clear, he'd walked away rather than take responsibility. "No, it's not complicated," James said firmly. "It's simple. Your son is a selfish coward, and his wife is a spoiled brat who never learned that the world doesn't owe her anything. What they did to you is inexcusable." Hearing someone else say what she'd been thinking but hadn't dared voice out loud was like having a weight lifted from her chest. For months, she'd been wondering if she really was selfish for not giving Lilia the cruise money, if she really was wrong to refuse to risk her house for their vacation. James's outrage on her behalf confirmed what her gut had been telling her all along. "I keep thinking I should call him," Marlene confessed. "Maybe try to work things out somehow." "What would be the point?" James asked. "So he can hurt you again? So his wife can make more demands?" "Marlene, some people will take everything you're willing to give and then blame you for not having more. It sounds like that's exactly who your son turned into." The truth of that statement hit her like a revelation. David had taken her money, her support, her love, her home, and when she couldn't give him more, he'd made her homelessness her fault. Even after everything that had happened, she'd been considering reaching out to him again, ready to accept more blame and ask for more scraps of affection. "You're right," she said quietly. "You're absolutely right. The question now is what you can do going forward, James said. And I have some thoughts about that, if you're interested in hearing them. Marlene looked at him suspiciously. She'd learned to be wary of people offering help, especially when she was in such a vulnerable position. Too often, help came with strings attached, with expectations and obligations that made the situation worse instead of better. "What kind of thoughts?" she asked carefully. James smiled, and for a moment, he looked exactly like the 18-year-old boy who used to walk her home from school. "I need a vice president of guest services for Morrison Maritime, someone who understands hospitality, who can manage people, who has the life experience to handle any situation that comes up on a cruise ship. The job pays $80,000 a year plus benefits, include housing, and comes with a 20% stake in the company." Marlene stared at him, sure she'd misunderstood. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a career," James corrected, "and a chance to start over. You've spent 40 years taking care of other people, putting their needs ahead of your own. Maybe it's time someone took care of you for a change." "James, I don't know anything about the cruise ship business," Marlene protested. "I've been working in a diner for 30 years. I've never even been on a cruise ship." "You've been managing people and handling customer service for 30 years, James pointed out. "You've dealt with every type of personality, solved problems under pressure, and kept a business running smoothly. Those skills translate perfectly to cruise ship operations. As for not having been on a cruise, that's easily fixed. Our next cruise launches in 2 weeks. You can work alongside our current guest services manager, learn the ropes, see if it's something you want to pursue long-term." The offer was so generous, so completely unexpected, that Marlene couldn't quite believe it was real. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you offer me something like this?" James was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the water. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before I left the Navy?" Marlene thought back to that painful evening 40 years ago, when they'd both known they were saying goodbye forever. "I told you that I hoped you'd find what you were looking for out there. And I told you that I already had everything I was looking for right here," James said softly. "I was 18 and stupid, and thought I needed to see the world before I could appreciate what was right in front of me. By the time I figured out what I'd given up, you were married to someone else, building the life you deserved." "James, I'm not trying to recreate the past," he said quickly. "Too much has happened. We're different people now. But I never stopped caring about you, Marlene. When I heard about Robert's death, I thought about reaching out, but I figured you had David and your friends and your life here. I didn't want to complicate things for you. And now I find out that the people who should have been taking care of you threw you away like garbage," James said, his voice hard with anger again. "Now I find out that you're living in your car while your son and his wife are probably planning their next expensive vacation. So yes, I'm offering you a job and a partnership and a chance to start over. But I'm also offering you friendship, companionship, and the respect you deserve." Marlene felt tears sliding down her cheeks, the first tears she'd allowed herself since the night David and Lilia left. For weeks, she'd been focused on just surviving, on getting through each day without falling apart completely. She hadn't allowed herself to think about the future beyond finding a cheap apartment and rebuilding some kind of basic stability. Now James was offering her something she'd never imagined possible. Not just a job, but a career. Not just housing, but a partnership in a successful business. Not just survival, but a chance to thrive. "What if I'm terrible at it?" she asked, wiping her eyes. "What if I can't learn the cruise business? What if I let you down?" "Then we'll figure out together," James said simply. "But I don't think you'll be terrible at it. I think you'll be amazing at it. You've been managing difficult people and impossible situations your whole life. A cruise ship full of passengers is just a floating diner with better views." Despite everything, Marlene laughed. The image of treating cruise passengers like diner customers was absurd enough to break through her anxiety and fear. Maybe James was right. Maybe all those years of dealing with demanding customers and solving problems on the fly had been preparing her for something bigger than she'd ever imagined. "I don't even have proper clothes for a job like that," she said, looking down at her practical but worn diner uniform. "We'll take care of that," James assured her. "The company has accounts with several clothing stores. We'll get you everything you need for the cruise and for your new position. Consider it a signing bonus." "You're really serious about this," Marlene said, still hardly believing it was happening. "Dead serious," James confirmed. "Marlene, I've built this business from nothing into something I'm proud of, but success doesn't mean much if you don't have people to share it with. I've spent 15 years building something impressive, but I've been doing it alone. I'd like to change that, if you're interested." The offer was overwhelming, almost too good to be true. After months of rejection and disappointment, of doors slamming in her face and applications being denied, someone was offering her not just help but opportunity, not just charity but partnership. "When would I start?" she heard herself asking. James smiled broadly. "How about right now? Let's go get your things from wherever you've been staying. Find you a proper place to sleep tonight, and start planning your new life." As they walked back toward the marina office, Marlene felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. For the first time since David and Lilia had walked out her house, she could envision a future that didn't involve just scraping by and surviving. She could imagine herself in professional clothes, solving problems for cruise passengers, maybe even traveling to exotic ports she'd only seen in travel brochures. The transformation didn't happen overnight. The first few weeks of Marlene's new life were a whirlwind of learning and adjustment. James set her up in a beautiful waterfront apartment that came with her position, helped her shop for professional clothing that made her feel confident and capable, and introduced her to the Morrison Maritime team. Part of Marlene wanted to call him, to share her good news and maybe rebuild their relationship. But a bigger part of her had accepted that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. David had made his choice when he'd chosen Lilia over his mother. Now Marlene was making her choice to focus on the people who valued and respected her rather than those who had thrown her away. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now working the cruise ship industry, the same industry that had started the conflict with David and Lilia. But her role was different. She was providing genuine value, using her skills and experience to create positive experiences for passengers. She wasn't asking anyone to fund her luxury vacation. She was working hard to ensure other people's vacations were everything they'd hoped for. As the months passed and Marlene worked more cruises, her reputation in the industry grew. Passengers specifically requested cruises where she'd be working. Travel agents recommended Morrison Maritime partly because of the exceptional guest services. The company's customer satisfaction scores reached record highs. James was thrilled with Marlene's success, but he wasn't surprised by it. "I always knew you had this in you," he told her one evening as they reviewed passenger feedback from their latest cruise. "You just needed the right opportunity to show it." The partnership aspect of her role was also proving valuable. Marlene's practical experience and customer-focused perspective helped James make decisions about everything from menu planning to shore excursion partnerships. She understood what passengers really wanted versus what they said they wanted, and her input was helping Morrison Maritime stay ahead of their competitors. But Marlene's new life was about to face its biggest test yet. As they prepared for a 10-day Mediterranean cruise, James handed her the passenger manifest with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You might want to look at this," he said quietly. Marlene scanned a list of names, and her heart stopped when she saw them. Mr. and Mrs. David Richardson, her son and daughter-in-law, had booked passage on the very cruise ship where she worked. After almost a year of silence, she was about to come face to face with the people who had destroyed her old life and inadvertently led her to her new one. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony after all. Subscribe to see how Marlene handles this ultimate test of her new life and dignity.